Jessica Kender, you're nominated for an Emmy for production design for a narrative period or fantasy program, 1 hour or more, for your work on the limited series Daisy Jones and the Six. This is your first Emmy nomination. So what was your reaction to getting that recognition?
Well, I was outside gardening because I didn't want to get myself nervous, and heard my phone blowing up a bunch of times, and it blew up enough that I was like, this probably isn't people just calling to say like, hey, too bad. And I happened to pick up the phone just as my producer was calling me, and I have to say I was shocked, and I'm still in shock. It's such an honor to know that people like what you're doing, and that people also who are from your peer group, because that's who votes on us, also think what you're doing is something of note. You know, it's the biggest compliment you could possibly get.
And you're specifically nominated for the finale episode of the series, Rock and Roll Suicide. Wondering what made you submit that episode in particular as an example of your work?
Well, that episode, it was pretty easy because it did two things that were sort of perfect. One is that it has our concert, which is we literally built, you know, a concert stage in 4 days down in New Orleans, which was the one thing when I read the book and the script where I was like, am I going to do that? Like, how am I going to do that? Like, I don't know how to do that. So it had that stage, which had to get in there. And then second, it has this massive amount of flashbacks that shows all the work we did for the whole series, which meant both of my decorators, Lisa and Andy, could get recognition as well. So it was sort of the perfect, like, it's the perfect show because it shows our biggest accomplishment just physically, and it also shows just the body of work we did. And let's be honest, it's a finale, so it's great. You know, just if you're having people watching for the first time, you want to show something that wows them, and this show wows.
And that Soldier Field concert that you create is very visually striking and impressive, and you feel the grandeur of it. You know, what's the starting point of figuring out how to create that, and you know, were you researching Soldier Field, and like what went into that?
Well, we started, obviously, I think all of design starts in research, you know, and we started pulling concerts from the day to just see sort of what we would want to base off of. And I had a couple that I really loved, you know, the Wall of Sound from back when, which was just speakers everywhere, you know, and as you start looking at different concerts, you realize there's a basic language in them. So we started picking that up, and then it was the matter of, okay, we know what we want it to look like, but how are we actually going to do that, and how are we going to do it, period. So I both pulled from a friend of mine, Drew, who works in concert travel with Jay-Z, you know, and he could sort of help me along for like, this is what things look like. And then my supervising art director, Brian, was like, we are going to have to get someone in from the live world instead of what we do, who does this type of thing, who can help us figure out how we organize a 4-day install for this. So there were a mix of that. You know, we ended up finding a company in Pennsylvania that still put up stages with the period scaffolding like they did back in the day, you know, so we had them come out to us. We, from a lighting standpoint, you know, because the lights were such an integral part of the set, I worked with lighting more than I typically would because it was going to be what we were going to see. And we, I think, got all of the period lighting from the US, like all over, like bought people out so that we could get it shipped to us, you know. And then there were fun parts about it where we are a TV show, you know, we're trying to make it look like real life, but there are other things about it that we need to address. So a lot of these stages had giant painted backings, but for us, so much of what happens in the story takes place backstage as well as front of stage. And I didn't want to have all our characters standing in front of just a plain white muslin backing. So Brian had brought up the idea of like, what if we use a scrim, which is a theatrical gimmick where you light it from the front, it's solid, light it from the back, you can see through, which meant when we are backstage, you could always get a hint of the front of stage that was happening. So it help build the tension. So there were a lot of fun things we did like that, along with just shooting in a place where we never actually had a lot of audience. you know, when you looked out in front of it. So that was like a fun thing when we went to New Orleans and I had to hand in to the city my plans. They wrote back and were like, you drew it wrong, because the way they normally set up their stages was the exact opposite of us. And I was like, no, we're creating that whole other part. I need it this way. So it was a lot of little things like that.
And what would you say was the overall ratio of like builds for the show versus the locations and you know, using locations for different settings?
Well, this show was definitely much more location based than any other show I've done. We didn't have what I would call a permanent set that we went back to. However, to say it was just location isn't totally accurate, because everything that we did on location, we almost shouldn't say everything, about half of what we did, we would rebuild the inside anyway. So when you see Sound City, we came into that lobby and everything had been stripped away. You know, it's glossy concrete floors, exposed rafters, that type of thing. So essentially we built our lobby set within the lobby, you know, and then when you're in the live rooms or the control rooms, when you're looking at the walls, they're all walls that we put up inside of their walls. There was a big discussion about where to spend the money. Should we build or should we shoot on location? And it was sort of agreed that coming to these locations, and even if we're essentially building a set within a set, the bones and the ghosts of the past that were there are going to give not only the actors, but the crew this added level of, I don't know, this quality that you really can't put your finger on it, but it's there. You know, Fleetwood Mac recorded albums here. You know, this board is where great music was composed. And so while we're in those spaces, that comes across in a way that you can't quantify.
And the series follows its characters from the late 60s through the 70s. You know, how did you approach that era, and kind of, you know, were you looking at like sort of subtle stylistic changes that are happening between like when we first meet them and, you know, as they're sort of at their last performance, their last time together?
Well, what's actually amazing is because the late 60s and the 70s honestly is a beloved time, there is a ton of research. This is the first time on a show where we literally had a file cabinet that was just research. You know, usually you have tons of folders and binders. We had an entire file cabinet, and I had what I called our art department Bible. So every set would have a picture of how it looked right now, a picture of if we were seeing it in the 60s, where it was in the 60s, and then if we were seeing it again in the 70s. And there's such a plethora of information out there that we were able to flip back and forth so we could address all those things. I mean, there was a guy who took pictures of the entire Sunset Strip over and over again. So you could see how it was in the 60s, then come back 2 years later, how it looked 2 years later. So it's sort of amazing because all you need to do was look for it and the information was there.
And so was it possible to source a lot of materials or did you still have to custom make a lot?
You know, it's interesting. My favorite find that we found was there was this source for period wallpaper that was actually, it's just this woman who sells online. And a lot of the time she would have like 6 rolls or whatever. So I built set sizes. Like there is a bathroom I did that has it's like 6'7", 6'5" on this one, but we built it so that it would fit the wallpaper. And I would say that was my most exciting find. Stuff like the furniture, because it's so beloved, there's a lot to find out there if you look for it. When it comes down to like the really, you know, shag carpeting and that stuff, that gets a little harder. We did a lot of reproductions there. But there was even in Sound City this great thing that we found when we were scouting where they had burlap over all these baffles on the walls. And on one scout, I had an art director pull back the burlap, and the vintage fabric that you saw in a picture that we have of research with Stevie Nicks singing was hidden behind the burlap. So there were great things that you could find. And if not, it's so beloved, people know how to make it again.
Congratulations on your work on the show, all the detail that you brought to it, and of course the Emmy nomination that you earned for it. So thank you so much for talking to me about it. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.